Share via email. Report story. Chapter 7. Izuku did not hesitate as Ochako began to lean to one side and eventually fell off of her knees entirely. Activating his quirk and leaping towards her, he managed to catch her well before she hit the ground. Her face was the palest he had seen it and her breath was fast and short. He did not speak to her. He was already worried enough about her. He did not need her to try to talk to him as if her body was not almost completely twisted up. His own legs protested with weariness and slight pain, but he did not even acknowledge his own body as he adjusted her so that one of his arms was curled beneath her knees while the other was cradling her upper back and shoulders. She naturally tilted her head so that it could rest in the crook of his neck, making him blush despite himself as she sighed with content. Nobody else spoke either, their eyes wide and their bodies so tired they were barely able to walk. They all knew they had faced some serious dangers, but at that moment, none of them could remember them being as dangerous as this one. Aizawa finally broke the silence with a small cough as he cleared the dust from his throat. Come on everyone. I'll call the police and an ambulance, but let's get up to the surface for some fresh air. Everyone agreed with quiet mumbles of acceptance before making their way towards the tunnel they had come in from. Hey sensei, Kirishima asked from the entrance of the tunnel. I don't know how we are going to get back up. This tunnel's surface is completely smooth. Su allowed Aizawa to drift to the tunnel entrance and peer up into it, his face scrunched in concentration. Does anyone have enough energy to do a quick scout of the walls for another way out? Aizawa asked around as a general idea. It's okay, I have a better idea, Su said. Gently setting Aizawa on the ground, she turned to Tokiyami and smiled at him. If Dark Shadow is up to it, maybe I can use my tongue and you can use Dark Shadow to lift our friends up through the tunnel. Tokiyami nodded and a battered shoji came up beside him. I can also help a little, he said, his many arms gesturing at the tunnel entrance. Are you sure you are up to that? Aizawa asked, a slight hint of concern in his voice. Of course, Su said confidently despite her tiredness. Aizawa hesitated but then nodded in confirmation. All right everybody, form a line starting with the most injured and ending with Midoriya and Uraraka since they will be a heavier load. Aizawa glanced over at the pair and saw Izuku nod in agreement before making his way to the back. Su started with Momo Yaoyorozu while Shoji took Todoroki and Tokiyami carried Iida. One at a time, the three lifted their fellow students up through the tunnel until everyone except Aizawa, Izuku, Ochako, and Su remained. Su had insisted on Tokiyami and Shoji going up first. Take them first, Aizawa said gesturing towards Izuku, who still cradled Ochako to his chest. Sure thing Aizawa, Su said wrapping her tongue around Izuku's waist and carefully lifting them through the tunnel. Izuku heard her grunt at their combined weight but she kept them held high until the brightening night sky was visible. They broke through the tunnel entrance and Izuku gasped, filling his lungs with the fresh night air, fully enjoying its coolness as it washed over his face and refreshed his body. Aizawa came up next, followed by Sue, who vaulted herself through the entrance by wrapping her long tongue around a nearby tree with the help of Dark Shadow, who reached down to assist her. The group just sat in the grass for a while, panting heavily and waiting for the sweat to dry on their skin while they waited for the police and ambulances to arrive. Shoji and Tokiyami sat together in the soft grass, discussing their different experiences with the same villain. Todoroki was still sitting with Yaoyorozu, who had come back from being knocked out but was still a little disoriented, leaning on Todoroki for support even while they sat in the grass. Bakugo sat with Kirishima, who was wrapping a small bandage wrap he had brought with them just in case around a small gash on Bakugo's arm. Bakugo scoffed and complained that he did not need the bandage but allowed Kirishima to do it anyway, slightly enjoying the closeness of his boyfriend. Aizawa was lying in the grass with his phone in his hand and his capture weapon in his other, as he stared off into the distance, watching for the police. Finally, Sue, Iida, Izuku, and Ochako all sat under a nearby small oak tree in the slightly darker shade despite the chill in the night air. Sue and Iida were talking rapidly about the villain's quirk, but Izuku was not interested in discussing quirks for the first time in his life. He was fully immersed in the life in his arms, holding her to him as if to protect her from anything that might jump out at them. A few tears slid down his cheeks, but he was able to control his emotions for the most part, for her sake. If he fretted too much, she might become too horrified with the condition of her body. Ochako shifted a little in his lap, her head nuzzling into his chest and her hands resting beneath her chin. One was balled into a light fist to support her head while the other was splayed out on Izuku's chest, her fingers resting on his fine-toned abs. Once everyone had emerged from the tunnel, Aizawa had used two extra hair bands that had been sitting on his wrist to tie Ochako's thumb to the palm of her hand, as if she were making the number 4, to keep her from involuntarily causing things to float. Izuku was grateful for that now as Ochako slept on his chest, glad that he would not have to be tethered to the ground to keep from floating away. Promoted stories. You'll also like Return of Mokuden discontinued 3.5K45. This story is officially up for adoption. If anyone is interested, message me or comment on the story. Izuku's Harem Academia 187K1.7 Cust. Read. Convicted Hearts 3680, like my other story but ILI longer. The Kings and Queen Yandere Wakfu X Reader 57.2K 1.8 Kyonder. Wakfu X Reader. Images do not belong to me unless stated. Wakfu does not belong to me, it belongs to Enigma. This is being rewritten in another book on my profile. Much needed love Yandere Succubus Momo X Izu 51.4K 809. After Wattpad had decided to delete this story out of nowhere, I and many reader were distraught. So I'm making a remake of the story from the ground up to compensate. Feelings. Aizawa. X-Reader 57.2K 1.3 KRE posting. This until I edit it, sorry if it's not good, it's my first time writing a story. You enroll at UA and you have multiple quirks you are really good at using. Why? Free. Oni shots 149K3K. This is a collections of free X readers. Requests on this are now closed. Izuku blushed as she moved against him, her body trying to snuggle even closer to his. He knew it didn't mean anything. She was barely conscious and he was trying to support her, so of course, she would try to get as close to his warm body as possible, but it still caused butterflies to jolt in his stomach every time she moved. He looked down at her, surprised by her small form as she lay in his lap. She felt light, as if she might float away into the wind if he did not hold on to her. With this thought, he squeezed her gently with one hand on her shoulder, as if to anchor her to him. She responded by nuzzling her face even more into his chest and gripping his body a tiny bit tighter with her splayed hand. That was when a low rumble sounded over the quiet meadow. Every student tensed up, but relaxed when Kirishima pointed towards the street at the flashing lights. "It's the police," he yelled excitedly, his voice filled with the relief that his other fellow students felt but didn't voice. After a short while, the droning was joined by the distant wailing of sirens as the police and two ambulances tore down the street. The students waited patiently for the cops to arrive and only stood up from their resting spots when the cars had pulled to a stop. The sirens wailed one last time before dying out, only the flashing lights remaining as the officers filed out of the cars. The chief of police stepped out of the first car, followed by All Might. The students called out incredulously. "Yes, I'm here. Is everyone okay? Who is hurt?" All Might asked, fretting even before his second leg was out of the car. "Take it easy, soldier," the chief said. "I'll do the statistics and then you may worry about them." All Might's gaze swept over his students and fellow teacher one last time before he nodded and sagged against the car door. "All right then." The chief looked directly at each student. "Who was severely injured in this party?" Aizawa used a tree to help himself stand before addressing the chief. Eijiro Kirishima, Katsuki Bakugo, Tsuyu Asui, Shoto Todoroki, Fumikage Tokiyami, and Izuku Midoriya only have minor injuries such as a few small gashes and bruises, he said, pointing to each respective student as he addressed them. But Ochako Uraraka, Momo Yaoyorozu, Tenya Iida, and Mezu Shoji all got hurt pretty significantly, he said, gesturing to them. "I suggest you get them some help right away." The chief nodded and jotted down a few quick notes on a pad before glancing at Aizawa. "You know, you don't look so good yourself, Eraser." "I know. I think I may have broken a few ribs when being crushed from one of his metal claw arms," he groaned, twisting his body slightly from side to side until he winced with pain. "We will get immediate help for you as well," the chief said, jotting down a few more notes. "One last thing, where is the villain?" the chief asked. As if on cue, the other officers surrounding him raised their weapons a little higher into the air. He was knocked out when Ochako Uraraka used a wonderfully executed attack to get him out of the running and save her friends. He is down in the tunnels somewhere. The chief looked down at the ground, his men copying him, and then looked back up at the girl lying limply in Izuku's arms. It looks like it cost her no matter how well she performed her attack. He said. No, Aizawa countered. She was tortured before we arrived to save her. The chief looked up at Aizawa and All Might snapped his attention to Izuku and Ochako. Izuku held Ochako to him even more tightly at that, her screams echoing in his head like knives stabbing his heart. Ochako did not move at his tightened touch. All right, that is all I needed to know. I will quickly have my men ready the ambulance while some friends and I investigate the area. The chief said, signaling with his left hand to the left wing of men who approached the ambulance and began helping to unload it. The right wing turned away from the students and followed the chief towards the tunnel entrance to get a closer look. As soon as the men broke off, All Might rushed over to each student, quickly checking them over for any fatal injuries. He was happy to see that even some of the more major injuries were not too serious. Then he finally made it to Izuku and Ochako. Izuku did not even realize that his idol was standing beside him until he cleared his throat softly. Izuku jumped and looked at his teacher in shock. Sorry, All Might, I was a little distracted and didn't see you there. I figured, All Might said with a small smile and a soft chuckle. But his eyes were filled with sadness when he looked down at the pretty girl. Her legs were twisted and her side was mangled by a bloodthirsty bullet. How is she holding up? All Might asked after a moment of silence. Izuku did not take his eyes off of her when he answered. She is strong, but she is slowly losing this battle. I don't know how much longer she can fight. Another tear slid down his face despite his efforts to stifle it. All Might felt his own tears prick at his eyes as he saw his future predecessor cry over his dying friend. She will make it, All Might said, forcing his tears to the back of his throat so that he sounded surer of himself. As you said, she is strong. All Might placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder and pulled him into a loose one-armed hug before releasing him to check on the other students. Izuku sat down on the grass again as he waited for the ambulance to be ready. He knew that the police were working fast to get it set up, but he felt as if he had been there for a lifetime. He gazed down at Ochako, his heart full of love and worry as her breathing became ever more shallow. He started to talk to her, his voice cracking as he spoke. Hey, you are going to be okay, Ochako. More tears spilled down his cheeks. And after you get all better, we can go get ice cream, my treat. We can also play games in the common space back at the dorms. I want to learn how to beat you at Super Smash Bros. He wiped his tears away and forced his voice to grow stronger, for her. We can also go sparring if you want. You are already an amazing fighter, but you said that you wanted some more one-on-one practice. You will kick my ass, but it will be a lot of fun. Just keep fighting and then we can go home. I am with you. No matter the danger, I am with you. He paused. Forever. The tiniest smile tugged at the corners of her lips and that gave Izuku hope like a flashlight turned on in a dark room. That's it, Ochako. Just keep fighting and it can just be us, together forever as everlasting friends. We've already weathered every other significant event fate has thrown at us. We can sure as hell survive this one. A bigger smile appeared on her face. It wasn't much, it was just a larger curl of the corners of her mouth, but it gave Izuku a feeling like he was being filled with warm liquid gold. He finally couldn't take it any more. Leaning down ever so slightly, holding her firmly in his lap, he brushed his lips against hers. He did not want to hurt her, and he doubted she even felt the same way, but he had to do it now, no matter the consequences that may come later. He only brushed her lips, nothing more, but when he pulled away, her smile was the widest he had seen it since she had been captured, brightening the dark world around them like a bright, deep-sea lantern. That was when a loud explosion sounded in the distance. Izuku twirled around, careful not to hurt Ochako too much as he did so. Smoke was unfurling from the tunnel entrance, coiling and uncoiling like angry gray wraiths. A deep laugh echoed from its depths and rose to meet them, getting higher and higher as it came closer to the surface until it sounded like the true call of a psychopath. Izuku growled and took a protective stance, leaning his body slightly over his own arms so as to protect his best friend with his life. A lot of the policemen had been tossed to the side like rag dolls, their bodies hitting the ground with dull thuds. The policeman who had begun loading students on stretchers into the ambulance whipped around confused, only to be met with the insane eyes of the metallic villain, his body once again coated in silvery liquid metal that had hardened to form armor. Guess who? The villain cried out with a cackle before running at the assembled group with an angry screech that reverberated around the entire meadow valley. Chapter 8. Everyone acted at once, policemen and students running in all directions to avoid the attack. The villain galloped on his many arms at the people gathered in the meadow, and this time, he had way more than just eight. More arms than anyone could count sprouted from his back, legs, arms, and even his head, snapping their pointed tips and whipping around to grab at students. Sue ducked and leapt into the air as four arms came after her at once, reaching for her long hair as she sailed away from them. Dark shadow erupted from Tokiyami's chest with a loud roar as seven arms went for him. The bird boy winced as his quirk grew large and fierce in the paling dark of the night, but he managed to keep Dark Shadow to a minimum. Shoji grappled with another five arms, his tentacles clenching the metal so hard that they began to dent inward despite Shoji's exhaustion. Ochako's eyes flew open at the concussive sounds that boomed around them. All of her muscles tensed so painfully at the noise that she cried out despite herself, receiving a comforting squeeze from Deku, who still held her in his arms. She looked up and found him looking down at her, his eyes filled to the brim with worry. That was when she felt a slight jolt as energy from his quirk flooded her, green lightning lighting up around them. Hold on tight, he whispered through clenched teeth, trying to remain unnoticed despite his flashy quirk. Ochako reached one hand up to reach around his neck while she used her other one to grasp his bare shoulder. Once he was sure she was holding on, Izuku held her ever tighter to his chest and crouched low to the ground before shooting high into the air. Power surged through his body as they flew, his eyes darting from the landscape around them to Ochako and back again. Finally, he found a small indention in the earth, a low dip that was just hidden enough that the villain would not spot her but shallow enough that she could easily get help should she need it. Izuku landed and immediately shut off his quirk, the green lightning dying into nothing but little crackles of remaining energy. Izuku gently settled Ochako into the ditch, but even as he tried to get her to relax, she kept trying to rise despite the fact that she couldn't walk. Ochako, where are you trying to go? He asked, placing a firm but gentle hand on her chest. On a normal day, she would have been able to use her quirk to push him off, but in this weak state she could barely sit up. I want to help, she croaked as she tried once again to push herself to her elbows. No, Izuku said more sharply than he meant to. You are in no condition to fight. I just can't lay HH here while you G go off to fight that H horrible villain, Ochako said as she strained once more to get up. Izuku knew she couldn't fight, but he also understood how she felt. He looked her in those gorgeous chocolatey eyes and saw a sparkling determination that mimicked, even possibly rivaled, his own. Izuku lifted one of her hands and placed his palm against hers. He saw her eyes flicker with something he could not read, but only for a moment before it was gone so fast he could have sworn he imagined it. He ignored the glance for now and continued to scan her face. Fine, he said with a soft sigh. Please wait here, I have an idea. Ochako paused for a moment but nodded and leaned back into the grass. Once he was sure she was going to stay, Izuku rose from his place beside her and activated his quirk. He was gone before Ochako could blink, tearing into the sky as if he were a trapped eagle. She waited patiently, itching to try to help but followed Izuku's lead instead, choosing to trust him first. She was happy that she didn't attempt the second option when Izuku came flying back, another person following him speedily on the ground. It only took a few seconds for the pair to get close enough to her for her to recognize her other best friend Iida. Izuku landed and Iida skidded to a stop, his engine legs hissing with steam. What's the plan, Midoriya? Iida asked as he beheld the crippled Ochako lying in the grass. I need you to carry Ochako. She wants to help with the battle, but it is obvious that that cannot happen. He took a deep breath. I want you to carry her to the ambulance that is still trying to take people away, but maybe, at a distance, allow her to survey the action so that she can at least see what is going on, Izuku said. Ochako still wanted to help, but she understood that this was the best they could do in her condition. Iida looked her up and down, his glasses glinting as he surveyed her wounds. Are you sure this is a good idea? Iida asked, glancing at Izuku, worry making him look older than he really was. It's the best I've got and I understand how she feels enough to not just leave her here. Just make sure you stay far enough away from him so that he doesn't notice you. If he does, I will do everything in my power to keep that from happening and your engine legs should be fast enough to get her out if need be. Iida tapped a finger against his chin as he contemplated, his eyes finally making their way to Ochako's face. Izuku knew he saw the determination in there too, right beside the dimmed pain in her eyes. Finally, he sighed. All right, I'll do it, but you need to follow my exact rules, Uraraka, okay? Ochako nodded gratefully and raised her arms up so that he could carry her. Once she was securely in Ida's arms, Izuku cast one last glance at her, his eyes filled with fear, worry and love. Ochako sucked in a breath as she realized what emotion was filling his face, but he was already gone. Iida heard her rushed breath and checked on her before shooting after Izuku towards the action while remaining at an angle just far enough to stay out of the villain's focus. They crested the hill where the valley sat and Ochako had to shut her eyes at the brightness of the rising sun. The sun's early rays stained the meadow red and glinted off of the silver armor of the villain until it was nearly blinding to look at him. The villain used this to his advantage, managing to fight off the police and the students who attacked him in an effort to protect the most severely injured who were still being loaded into an ambulance. Ignoring the red-hot pain in her legs, forcing it to dim, Ochako shifted herself to avoid the rapid movements of Ida's pumping legs as he ran and peered out into the meadow. Tokiyami was still fighting alongside Todoroki and Sue, but Yaoyorozu was gone along with Shoji and Aizawa. Hiroshima and Bakugo were also still fighting, their combined quirks causing a surprising amount of damage to the supervillain. All Might was helping to protect the ambulance and loading the injured on board since his battle with All for One had nearly destroyed his ability to remain in his hero form. Even now he was struggling, but he refused to remain helpless while his students and friends were hurting. They had called for help from other heroes, but they could not wait until they arrived. Iida dashed along the perimeter of the meadow, allowing Ochako to scout from his arms but not getting any closer than the very edge of the fight. Ochako could barely even see what was going on, but she did not argue and tried to see what she could from her place. Iida bolted along the edge until he found a low rise in the ground. Breaking the rule ever so slightly and moving inside the perimeter, he was able to crouch behind the rise. Ochako scanned the battle for any sign of weakening in the villain but was unable to find any as the psychopath screeched with laughter as her classmates began to tire. The villain lifted an enormous clawed hand and was about to crush Tokiyami, who was busy fighting 5 other claw's arms, flat when a flash of green light whipped by and sent the clawed arm flying. The arm landed several feet away, sparking at the tips of its split wires before dying out and falling limp. The villain turned to try to face Izuku but was too slow, another flash of light sending another arm shooting off just as Tokiyami managed to use Dark Shadow to saw more off. Todoroki managed to freeze at least 12, shattering them before they could break free. A fire had proven almost useless against the metallic villain, but the use of ice was a much greater attacker. Izuku skidded to a stop beside his friends, his teeth bared in anger. "Oh, so angry," the villain said as he clacked his metallic teeth together. "You should really learn to manage that." The group said nothing and was joined by Kirishima and Bakugo short after. The villain glanced up as the ambulance engine started and the vehicle sped away but kept his eyes focused on the group for the most part. "You should talk," Kirishima said, his hands and arms hardening into rocks. His eyes revealed that he was exhausted. They all were, but they remained standing and continued to fight. The villain smiled a crooked grin at Kirishima, his eyes wild. "I guess I do have to work on relieving my anger better. I guess I should try some more physical techniques," he said, striking with a horde of clawed arms that had been gathering around them in the shadows. Izuku used his full cowling kicks to rip through the arms while Bakugo and Kirishima blasted through them with explosion and stone. Todoroki froze more arms while Tokiyami used Dark Shadow, who was more controllable with the light now, to break as many as he could. But the group was haggard with exhaustion, their fighting spirits slowly slipping away as they fought longer and longer. One claw slammed into Izuku's back and he let out a cry, his back cracking at the impact. "Deku!" Ochako called out without thinking. Iida froze as several of the claws ripped away from the battle to stare at the rise. Iida and Ochako were hidden by the hill, but they didn't know for how long. No pounding footsteps sounded beyond the hill as they waited with held breaths. No slithering along the soft meadow grass grated on their ears. Iida waited for several seconds, neither of them moving a muscle as they waited to see if they had been discovered. Iida only relaxed after several minutes had gone by, letting out a breath and hoisting Ochako carefully into a more comfortable position in his arms. Iida took a step forward. The ground beneath their feet exploded as 8 metallic arms broke through the ground with their razor-sharp teeth gnashing. Iida called out in surprise and exploded from the spot, his engine legs throwing him forward. But the arms were faster, latching onto Iida and Ochako and ripping them apart from one another. "Uraraka!" Iida screamed as they were both lifted into the air. The arms pushed through the soil, more arms joining them to restain Ochako and Iida as they got closer to the villain. Iida tried to pry them apart or melt them with his engines but failed every time and was only rewarded with a painful squeeze from the arms every time he struggled. Ochako wanted to struggle but was already trying as hard as possible not to black out from the pain. "Well, well, well," the villain sneered as the arms brought the pair to the villain. "Look who we have here, fresh meat." "No, Ochako." "Iida," Izuku called, followed by the rest of the assembled classmates down below. "Kill the engine one. I want the pretty one." The villain snarled. The claws took Iida and threw him into the ground hard enough to break bones. Iida screamed as he landed on the hard ground, his eyes watering. The claws were about to grab him again when Kirishima leapt in the way, using his quirk to take the pressure from the many metallic arms that crashed on him and swarmed him like bees. Meanwhile, Bakugo and Todoroki dove into the mess of arms to help Kirishima, the latter using a large shelf of ice to carefully lift Iida into the air and away from the villain. Izuku, though, only had eyes for Ochako, his attacks battering the villain around in quick kicks and punches while also dodging and evading his claws by shooting across the villain and pushing off of the hillside to go back across. But even as he managed to continuously hit the villain and avoid his worst attacks, he could not get near Ochako. He finally landed on the ground beside his friends, panting while sweat rolled down his face, back, and legs. His whole body felt hot but clammy despite the morning sun that was beginning to pleasantly warm the earth. I can't get to her. Izuku cried as the villain whipped around and slammed a large squad of metal arms into the ice that Todoroki had sent his way, shattering it into sharp little shards that collapsed to the ground in useless piles. Anger consumed Izuku as he stared up at Ochako, who was gripping the claws with shaking hands, her knuckles white and her eyes filled to the brim with pain, that defiant determination completely gone. We will get her back, Midoriya. Todoroki yelled as he ignited his flames and sent more ice slamming into the enemy. Izuku nodded with renewed determination, but a mighty flame still swirled in the pit of his stomach. Just hang in there a little bit longer, Ochako, he whispered. Keep going, for me. Izuku leapt again, this time at Ochako directly, his hands reaching for her as his speed and power sent him soaring over the enemy. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Ochako turned to him and reached out her hand. He lunged for it and was about to grab it when she slapped his hand, a faint pink glow shining out from her fingertips. Her pads, he realized, she had touched him with her finger pads to make him float. He flicked his finger, sending himself shooting away as the villain tried to swipe at him. Deku, tell Todoroki to bring some fire this way. Jump up with him and bring him and his fire to me. She screamed, her voice turning hoarse as she called out. Izuku was a bit confused by the instructions but sent another kick at the villain before nodding and landing quickly back in the meadow. He rushed over to Todoroki, dodging the metal claws that rained down on him as he ran, each one trying some new creative way to crush him. He finally made it over to his icy hot friend and yelled at him to follow. Todoroki did not hesitate as they galloped through the maze of writhing claws to the side that Ochako was on. Holding onto Todoroki's hand, Izuku leapt into the air, his quirk carrying him as fast as lightning despite the extra weight. Todoroki grunted as he raised his legs to avoid the claws that targeted him but flew up behind Izuku just like Ochako had asked. Once they were up to Ochako's height, Todoroki used a long staff of ice to pull themselves to the villain's body. He had to pause to freeze about 15 more arms that came his way, building something like an ice wall around them. The villain twisted, trying to reach them, but Bakugo and Kirishima were causing so much damage that the villain screamed in frustration when the pair flew around him. destroying his precious metal arms. What do you need me to do? Todoroki asked. Ochako motioned with her hand to a spot a little below where she was being held. Right below them, a bald patch of skin, not covered by armor, stood out in the intricate metal shields and armor that surrounded the villain. I think my earlier attack weakened him enough that he didn't have time to fully recharge his body enough to cover his entire body in metal. Ochako coughed out. This is our chance to knock him out for real this time. Todoroki and Izuku saw where she was talking about and immediately set to work. Izuku helped Ochako to pry off a piece of metal from his armor while Todoroki continued to fend off the increasing number of metal arms, their jaws snapping in anger. With a final heave, Izuku and Ochako managed to tear off a single loose piece of metal. It was in the shape of a small bowl, curved in on one side and hexagonal in shape. It was only about the size of a small water cup. Are you guys ready? Todoroki asked in a strained voice as several new claws cascaded down on the ice shield. Yes, Ochako said in a voice that she had wanted to sound strong but only came out in a ragged cough. Ready. 1, 2, 3. Izuku yelled. Todoroki switched as fast as possible from ice to fire and leaned down, pressing his palms to the bald patch at the base of the villain's neck. They heard the villain scream with a horrible screeching sound of agony as the flames caught onto his skin. Then, Ochako leapt forward as far as she could, fighting another wave of darkness and placed the small metal piece onto the wound, leaving one side partly raised to allow oxygen to get in. In order to get more oxygen, the flames suddenly dove down into the armor and raged down his unprotected skin. The metal arms started to malfunction and fall limp. But even as the villain screamed, he would not give up yet. Forcing the last of his claws into action, they began to squeeze Ochako until her screams joined his. Izuku and Todoroki ignored any restraint and pulled on her, trying to free her no matter how painful it was to her. But then the arms gave out. The villain wobbled in place, his towering form starting to crumble as pieces of metal fell off left and right and crashed to the ground. The villain soon followed his metal parts and landed on the ground with a mighty boom. Izuku grabbed a hold of Ochako and used his quirk one last time to shoot out of the crumbling villain's grasp. He landed a safe distance away. Todoroki soon followed suit on a thin piece of ice. The heroes arrived soon after, followed by another ambulance and All Might, but by then the villain had already fallen and Ochako had already succumbed to the darkness. Where stories live. Discover now.